Everyone knows about the extinction of the dinosaurs. Nobody talks about what happened 40 million years after it, and what changed the planet more radically than any asteroid. 23 million years ago, an epoch began that geologists call the Miocene. Over the following 18 million years, grasses seized a third of the land surface of the Earth. The largest land mammal in history, Paraceratherium, weighing 20 tons, went extinct because its forest world disappeared. In its place came creatures with new teeth and new legs, built for life on open plains. In 2026, researchers reported from Catalonia on the discovery of 14 skeletons of Parabos tigneresi, a half-ton ancestor of the buffalo that lived 4 million years ago. A transitional animal between two worlds. A study in PLOS1. A direct line from this creature to the domestic cow. And to the question, without the Miocene, would human civilization have been possible? Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you. There is a particular kind of revolution that leaves no explosion, no impact crater, no iridium layer in the geological record, because it does not arrive from outside the planet, but grows up from within it, 1 millimeter at a time, across millions of years. The Miocene revolution was of this kind. It was a revolution made of grass, and it is, by almost any measure of biological and geological consequence, one of the most significant transformations the Earth's surface has undergone in the past 100 million years. The Miocene epoch spans from approximately 23 to 5.3 million years ago, the first major division of the Neogene period in the Cenozoic era. In geological terms, it is recent, almost uncomfortably so. The continents were essentially in their modern positions. The Atlantic Ocean existed. The Indian Ocean existed. The Himalayan mountain chain, though lower than today, was already rising. The Mediterranean Sea, with one critical and extraordinary exception, that we will examine in detail, existed. The Miocene is not an alien world of unfamiliar geography, unlike the Ordovician or the Permian or the Cretaceous. It is our world, but with a different cast of animals, a different distribution of ecosystems, and a different biological economy that was in the process of transforming into the one that produced, eventually, us. To understand what the Miocene transformed, it is necessary first to understand what it inherited, the world of the Oligocene, the 34 million-year-old biological economy that the Eocene-Oligocene boundary cooling had established, and within which the dominant forms of life had been optimized for a planet substantially more forested than the one that would emerge from the Miocene's end. The Oligocene world, spanning from approximately 34 to 23 million years ago, was defined by the consequences of the most dramatic climatic transition of the Cenozoic. The formation of the Antarctic ice sheet at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, which lowered global temperatures sharply and drove a global reorganization of vegetation zones. The extraordinarily warm, ice-free world of the Eocene, a planet with tropical forests extending to the polar regions, sea surface temperatures in the Arctic approaching 20 degrees Celsius, and no permanent ice anywhere on Earth, gave way to a cooler, drier world, in which the tropical forest belt contracted toward the equator and temperate woodland and scrubland expanded at higher latitudes. But even this cooler Oligocene world was, by the standards of the Miocene that would follow, a predominantly closed, forested world. Open grassland in the Oligocene was a marginal environment, a curiosity found in the most arid continental interiors, not the planetary-scale biome it would become. The animals that inhabited this forested Oligocene world were built for it in every detail of their biology. The entelodonts, large pig-like omnivores sometimes called hell pigs in popular literature, though they were not closely related to modern pigs, were among the most formidable terrestrial predators and scavengers of the Oligocene. Their massive skulls equipped with teeth capable of processing both meat and bone in heavily forested and woodland environments where carcasses were a reliable resource. Entelodon magnus, the largest known species, reached shoulder heights of approximately 1.2 meters and body masses of perhaps 300 kilograms. A substantial animal by any standard, but dwarfed by the megafauna that the Miocene would eventually produce and then replace. The Chalicotheres, perissodactyls related to horses and rhinoceroses, but equipped with clawed feet rather than hooves, were uniquely adapted browsers that may have used their claws to pull down branches or dig for roots, occupying an ecological niche with no close modern equivalent. Moropus, perhaps the best-known Chalicothere, persisted from the Oligocene well into the Miocene, its presence in the fossil record serving as a biological thread, connecting the forested world of the earlier epoch to the transitional landscapes of the later one. The Oligocene seas were in the process of producing some of the most consequential biological innovations of the Cenozoic. Innovations that would come to full fruition in the Miocene. Whales, which had first appeared in the Eocene as semi-aquatic relatives of even-toed ungulates, still retaining rudimentary hind limbs and giving birth on land, had by the mid-Oligocene completed the transition to fully aquatic life and diversified into the two major groups that dominate the modern cetacean fauna, the toothed whales and the filter-feeding baleen whales. The ancestors of the modern baleen whales, evolving the most productive marine feeding strategy in the history of vertebrates, filtering enormous quantities of krill and small fish through plates of baleen derived from the same keratin as hair and fingernails, were already present in Oligocene seas, though the full diversification of the baleen whale lineage would await the Miocene cooling and its associated oceanographic changes. The continental positions of the Oligocene world differed from the modern configuration in ways that had significant consequences for oceanic circulation and global climate. The Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica, the seaway that allowed the development of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the ocean current that isolated Antarctica thermally from the rest of the world's oceans and enabled the formation of the Antarctic ice sheet, had only recently opened, and the full establishment of the circumpolar current system was still underway. The collision of India with Asia, which had begun in the Eocene, was continuing, and the Himalayan uplift was in its early stages. The Tethys Sea, the ancient equatorial ocean that had separated Africa and Eurasia throughout much of the Mesozoic and early Cenozoic, was being progressively reduced by the northward movement of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula toward Eurasia, with the western Tethys increasingly restricted and the precursor of the modern Mediterranean beginning to take shape. Into this world, forested, relatively warm by later Cenozoic standards, and biologically organized around the exploitation of woodland and forest resources, the Miocene arrived with a set of climatic and tectonic changes that would, over the course of 18 million years, produce one of the most thoroughgoing biological transformations since the Permian extinction. What the Miocene inherited from its predecessor epoch, the Oligocene, was a planet dominated by closed canopy forest and woodland. The great global cooling that had begun at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary approximately 34 million years ago, when the Antarctic ice sheet first formed and global temperatures dropped sharply, had already reduced the tropical forest cover that had blanketed much of the planet during the warm Eocene. But even in the cooler, drier Oligocene, the world's vegetation was predominantly closed. Trees, shrubs, and woodland, with open grassland restricted to scattered patches in the most arid continental interiors. The animals that dominated this closed world were built for it. Browsers that reached upward into the forest canopy or the woodland understory, using teeth designed for soft, nutritious leaf material and bodies designed for moving through complex three-dimensional environments, where the critical resources were distributed vertically rather than horizontally. The supreme expression of this forest-adapted mammalian world was Paraceratherium, an animal so large that its existence challenges the imagination even when encountered only through fossil remains. Paraceratherium was a hornless rhinoceros relative, a member of the subfamily Indricotherinae that lived across a vast range spanning from the Balkans to China and Pakistan during the Oligocene and earliest Miocene, from approximately 34 to 23 million years ago. Its fossils, found at more than a dozen sites across Eurasia, reveal an animal that stood approximately 4.8 meters at the shoulder, roughly 16 feet, and reached a body length of approximately 7.4 meters. Weight estimates from the skeletal proportions range from 15 to 20 tons, with some analyses suggesting potentially higher figures. At the upper end of the range, Paraceratherium may have weighed as much as 5 African elephants combined. No land mammal known from the fossil record was larger. No land mammal since has approached its size. To visualize Paraceratherium as it actually lived is to confront the extraordinary abundance of the Oligocene-Miocene transition forest world that made such an animal possible. A creature of 20 tons requires an equally extraordinary quantity of food. Estimates based on scaling relationships from modern large herbivores suggest that an adult Paraceratherium may have consumed hundreds of kilograms of plant material daily. This food came from the forest canopy, which Paraceratherium could access with a neck long enough and mobile enough to browse from the tops of trees that would be beyond the reach of any modern giraffe. The prehensile lip, larger and more dexterous than that of any modern rhinoceros, allowed selective feeding on the most nutritious leaves and shoots. Paraceratherium was, in ecological terms, a hyper-specialized mega-browser, an animal so committed to the exploitation of tall woodland vegetation that its entire body plan, from the pillar-like legs designed to support its immense weight, to the elongated neck optimized for vertical reach, was an engineering solution to the problem of accessing food sources high above the ground. For approximately 11 million years, this solution worked. Paraceratherium fossils span a range of habitats from subtropical forests to drier woodlands, suggesting that the genus was broadly successful across the varied environments of Oligocene and earliest Miocene Eurasia. The Tibetan Plateau, during this period, had not yet risen to its modern altitude. It was relatively low, perhaps below 2,000 meters, allowing relatively free movement of large animals across a region that today is an impassable high-altitude barrier. This geographic openness contributed to the wide range of Paraceratherium and to the genetic exchange between populations that allowed the genus to diversify into multiple species across its vast Eurasian distribution. Then the world changed. The reasons for the extinction of Paraceratherium approximately 23 million years ago, at the very beginning of the Miocene, the same time that grasses were beginning their planetary expansion, are multiple and interlocking, and they serve as the opening act in the story of how the Miocene transformed the biological economy of the Earth. The climate was shifting. The early Miocene saw a complex pattern of warming and cooling, with the global mean temperature first rising above Oligocene baseline values and then declining again, the general trajectory being one of increasing aridity and seasonal extremes in continental interiors. The forests and woodlands that had supported Paraceratherium were beginning to fragment and shrink. The broad, continuous woodland environments that had allowed Paraceratherium to find food across vast areas were being interrupted by increasingly open, dry country, in which tall tree vegetation became patchy and unreliable. Simultaneously, a biological invasion was underway. Gomphotheres, early relatives of elephants originating in Africa, began dispersing across Eurasia during the late Oligocene and early Miocene. Modern African elephants are well-documented ecological engineers. They destroy trees, strip bark, push over saplings, and systematically convert woodland into open grassland through their feeding behavior. Prehistoric Gomphotheres, being large proboscideans with similar feeding habits, are thought to have had comparable ecosystem engineering effects in the Eurasian environments they colonized. A large population of forest-destroying elephant relatives, spreading across the same Eurasian woodland environments that Paraceratherium depended on, may have accelerated the loss of the closed forest habitat that the giant hornless rhino required. New large predators, including Amphision, the bear dog, and Hyenilurus, a large hyena-like carnivore, also invaded Asia from Africa during the early Miocene, potentially targeting the calves of a species whose low reproductive rate, characteristic of very large mammals, would have made it highly vulnerable to elevated juvenile mortality. Paraceratherium's extinction was not, in this reading, a sudden catastrophe, but a slow squeeze. Fragmenting habitat, competing herbivores reshaping the remaining forest, new predators targeting its young, and a body plan so exquisitely specialized for one type of environment that it had no evolutionary pathway available for rapid adaptation to the emerging grassland world. By the time the Miocene was properly underway, the era of the giant forest browser was over, and the era of the grassland was beginning. The grass revolution of the Miocene was not, strictly speaking, a revolution in the sense of something new being invented. Grasses, members of the family Poaceae, had existed since the late Cretaceous, and their presence in the Eocene and Oligocene fossil record is well documented. What was new in the Miocene was not the existence of grasses, but their ecological dominance. The transition from grass as a minor component of forest understory and riverbank vegetation to grass as the defining plant of vast landscape-scale ecosystems covering millions of square kilometers. This transition, from grassland as a curiosity to grassland as a biome, is one of the most consequential ecological shifts in the Cenozoic, and its causes are sufficiently complex that paleobotanists and paleoecologists are still debating their relative contributions. The primary driver was climate change, specifically the trend toward increased aridity in the continental interiors of Eurasia, North America, and South America. As global temperatures gradually declined from the early Miocene warm period and mountain building, particularly the continued uplift of the Himalayas and the Rocky Mountain system, created rain shadows that dried out the continental interiors downwind of the newly elevated terrain. The conditions that had maintained dense forest vegetation became increasingly unavailable across large areas of the major continents. Forests require reliable, distributed precipitation. Grasses require much less, tolerate seasonal drought, can regrow rapidly after fire, and can colonize bare mineral soils that would challenge the establishment of tree seedlings. In regions where rainfall became insufficient or too seasonal for tree cover, grasses filled the ecological vacuum. The Himalayan uplift was particularly important, both directly and indirectly. Directly, the rising mountains created a massive rain shadow across Central Asia, driving the aridification of the Asian continental interior that converted what had been woodland and scrub into the steppe and grassland systems that today characterize the region from Kazakhstan to Mongolia. Indirectly, the Himalayan uplift intensified the South Asian monsoon system, delivering more concentrated and seasonal precipitation to the Indian subcontinent, and creating the sharp, wet-dry seasonality that characterizes monsoon-influenced grassland ecosystems. Enough water to support grass productivity during the monsoon, not enough to maintain closed canopy forest during the dry season. The research published in Global and Planetary Change in 2026 by Lukashevich and colleagues, analyzing phytolith assemblages, the microscopic silica bodies produced by grass cells and preserved in sediment long after the plant itself has decomposed. From early to late Miocene fossil sites in Greece, Turkey, and Iran, documents the progressive replacement of forest indicator phytoliths by open habitat grass phytoliths across the eastern Mediterranean region. The Middle Eocene baseline from the same region shows abundant bambusoid grass phytoliths alongside diverse forest indicator phytoliths, consistent with a woodland or forest with abundant bamboos. The Miocene assemblages, by contrast, are dominated by the silica short cells characteristic of open habitat grasses of the subfamily Puidae, the same grasses that today cover the Eurasian steppe and the grasslands of northern Europe. The transition is not instantaneous, but progressive, tracking the gradual expansion of open vegetation at the expense of forest across a geologically brief interval of several million years. The biological consequences of this vegetation transition were cascading and comprehensive. The primary challenge that grass poses to any herbivore that attempts to eat it is mechanical. Grass is tough, fibrous, and, crucially, siliceous. The phytoliths that serve as paleobotanical proxies in sediment cores served during the animal's lifetimes as the plant's principal defense against herbivory. Embedded in the leaf tissue of grass blades, microscopic particles of silica act as an abrasive that grinds down the surfaces of the teeth of any animal that chews grass. Browsers that eat soft woodland leaves experience relatively modest tooth wear over a lifetime. Grazers that process large quantities of silica-rich grass can wear through a tooth in a fraction of the time. An animal with the tooth structure of an Oligocene forest browser attempting to survive on Miocene grassland would, literally, grind away its dentition faster than it could reproduce and die of starvation from an inability to process food. Evolution's answer to this problem, developed independently in multiple herbivore lineages across the Miocene, was hypsodonty, the development of teeth with dramatically higher crowns than those of forest browsers, providing a much greater volume of enamel and dentine to wear away before the tooth was destroyed. The transition to hypsodont dentition is one of the most pervasive evolutionary trends documented in the Miocene fossil record, occurring convergently in horses, rhinoceroses, bovids, deer, camels, and various other ungulate groups, a remarkable demonstration of how a single environmental pressure applied broadly across an entire ecosystem can drive parallel evolutionary responses in phylogenetically unrelated lineages simultaneously. Among horses, the transition is particularly well documented. The Oligocene forest browser Mesohippus had relatively low-crowned browsing teeth, while the Miocene grazer Merychippus, which appeared approximately 15 million years ago, had dramatically higher crowned teeth, clearly adapted for processing siliceous grasses. By the end of the Miocene, the North American horses had developed some of the highest crowned teeth of any known mammal. An evolutionary arms race between grass and herbivore played out in enamel. The second major evolutionary challenge posed by grassland environments was predation risk. In closed forest or woodland, an herbivore's primary defensive option is concealment. The complex three-dimensional structure of dense vegetation provides hiding places, limits sightlines, and makes it difficult for a predator to track prey over extended distances. In open grassland, concealment is largely impossible. A large grazing herbivore on an open plain is visible from hundreds of meters in every direction, and a predator approaching from any angle has relatively little cover to exploit. The primary defense available in this environment is flight, the ability to detect a predator at sufficient distance and run away fast enough to escape. This straightforward logic drove one of the most striking evolutionary transformations of the Miocene: the elongation of limb bones and the reduction of the number of functional toes in ungulate lineages, producing the long, slender legs and efficient hoofed feet that characterize modern horses, antelopes, and cattle. The reduction of toe number in horses is the most thoroughly documented instance of this trend. Eohippus, the Eocene horse ancestor, had 4 toes on the front foot and 3 on the rear. Mesohippus had 3 toes on both. Merychippus had 3 toes, but the side toes were vestigial. And Equus, the modern horse, has a single functional toe, the hoof, with the remnants of the 2 side toes preserved as the splint bones flanking the cannon bone. Each reduction in toe number accompanied a corresponding increase in running efficiency, as the weight-bearing surface was concentrated on a single robust structure rather than distributed across multiple smaller ones. The modern horse's hoof is, in this sense, the endpoint of an evolutionary optimization problem that the Miocene grassland set. How do you run as fast as possible on a surface that offers consistent traction and minimize the energy cost of carrying limb weight at high speed? The predators of the Miocene grassland responded in kind. The emergence of extensive open grassland created a predatory opportunity. Vast herds of medium and large herbivores concentrated on flat, open terrain that favored predators capable of sustained pursuit over open ground. The felid lineage, which would eventually produce the modern cats, diversified dramatically during the Miocene, with the emergence of specialized pursuit hunters alongside the ambush specialist saber-toothed forms. The canid lineage, the dogs and their relatives, also underwent a major Miocene radiation, with the development of longer-legged, more cursorial forms adapted to the pursuit hunting strategy that became viable on open grassland, when prey could no longer disappear into forest cover at the first sign of danger. The Miocene grassland ecosystem was, in this sense, a co-evolutionary machine. The grasses drove the ungulates toward greater speed and endurance. The ungulates drove the predators toward greater pursuit capability, and the resulting ecosystem had a biological tempo, the dynamic, high-energy ecology of predator and prey on open plains, that was entirely new in the history of the Earth. The co-evolution of grasses and grazers involved more than just teeth and legs. It also involved gut physiology, the development of the complex, multi-chambered digestive systems that allow ruminants to extract the maximum nutritional value from the tough, cellulose-rich grass material that passes through their alimentary canal. Ruminants, the group that includes cattle, sheep, goats, deer, giraffes, and antelopes, digest their food through a 2-stage fermentation process. Plant material is first swallowed into a specialized stomach chamber called the rumen, where microbial fermentation begins breaking down cellulose. Then the partially digested material is regurgitated and chewed again, the familiar process of chewing cud, before being swallowed again for final digestion. This complex process, unique to the ruminant clade, allows the extraction of nutritional value from grass that would be largely unavailable to non-ruminant digestive systems. The radiation of ruminants during the Miocene, with hundreds of new species of deer, antelope, and bovid appearing across Eurasia, Africa, and North America, was the biological expression of this digestive innovation being deployed across a newly available and extraordinarily extensive food resource. The kelp forests that appeared in the Miocene seas were the marine equivalent of this terrestrial grassland revolution, a new, highly productive ecosystem type appearing simultaneously in the ocean and on land, both driven by the changing oceanographic and climatic conditions of the epoch. Kelp, large brown macroalgae of the order Laminariales, requires cold, nutrient-rich water, and the cooling of ocean temperatures during the Miocene created the conditions for kelp forest development along cold water coastlines that had previously been too warm to support it. The coastal upwelling systems of the eastern Pacific, driven by the winds associated with the developing high-pressure systems of the Miocene Pacific, delivered the cold, nutrient-rich water from depth that kelp required. The resulting kelp forest ecosystems, among the most productive marine environments on Earth, became the foundation for the radiation of pinnipeds, sea lions, seals, and walruses, which appear in the fossil record from the mid-Miocene onward, exploiting the fish and invertebrate communities supported by the new forest of kelp. Among the most significant biological developments of the Miocene, one whose consequences extend directly to the present, and indeed to the person reading these words, was the extraordinary radiation of the apes. The early Miocene, specifically the Aquitanian and Burdigalian stages from approximately 23 to 15 million years ago, saw the first diversification of the hominoids, the superfamily that includes the gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. More than 100 species of fossil primates have been described from Miocene deposits worldwide, a diversity vastly exceeding the approximately 20 hominoid species alive today, and reflecting the ecological opportunity available to medium and large-bodied primates in the forested environments that still characterized much of the Miocene Old World, even as those forests were being progressively reduced and fragmented at their margins by the advancing grassland. Dryopithecus, a genus of Miocene apes whose fossils have been found at sites across Europe from Spain to Hungary, was a forest-dwelling hominoid that walked on its knuckles in the manner of modern chimpanzees and gorillas, indicating that the adaptations for arboreal and semi-arboreal life, characteristic of the great apes, had already appeared well before the end of the Miocene. Sivapithecus, whose fossils come from South and Southeast Asia, is recognized as closely related to or ancestral to the modern orangutan lineage, demonstrating that the Asian great ape radiation was well underway by the Middle Miocene. Gigantopithecus, whose fossils, primarily jaw fragments and isolated teeth, have been found in South and Southeast Asia, represents perhaps the most dramatic hominoid of the Miocene and Pliocene, an ape that grew to an estimated height of nearly 3 meters and a weight of perhaps 200 to 300 kilograms, making it the largest primate that has ever existed. The June 2026 study, published in Science News Today, analyzing new fossil material from Chinese cave sites, has filled crucial gaps in the evolutionary history of Gigantopithecus blacki, clarifying its phylogenetic position and providing new evidence for the environmental conditions that led to its eventual extinction. Approximately 300,000 years ago, as bamboo forests in South China declined during a period of climatic instability. The evolutionary event of the Miocene that carries the greatest consequence for the present was subtler than the appearance of any individual giant or the invasion of any new ecosystem. It was the divergence, sometime in the latest Miocene between approximately 7 and 5 million years ago, of the lineage leading to modern humans from the lineage leading to modern chimpanzees. The precise timing and location of this divergence remain subjects of active research, complicated by the fragmentary nature of the hominid fossil record from this period, and by ongoing debate about the relationships between the various late Miocene hominid fossils that have been discovered. What is clear from the molecular phylogeny, the comparison of DNA sequences between living humans and chimpanzees, is that the two lineages share a common ancestor that lived during the late Miocene, and that the evolutionary forces that drove the divergence were related to the same environmental changes that had been transforming the African landscape throughout the preceding several million years. The East African Rift System, the great tectonic fracture zone that runs from the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia southward through Kenya and Tanzania, had been developing throughout the Miocene, with the gradual rifting and faulting associated with the incipient separation of the African plate, creating a north-south corridor of elevated, complex terrain on the eastern side of the continent. This topographic complexity, combined with the progressive drying of eastern Africa associated with the same global climatic trends that had been expanding grassland ecosystems across Eurasia, produced a mosaic of forest patches, woodland, and open grassland in the East African landscape that differed dramatically from the continuous forest cover of Western Africa. The common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived in a world that was changing beneath its feet. The reliable forest resources that had sustained its predecessors were fragmenting, and the open country between forest patches was expanding. The evolutionary pressures associated with moving across open ground, with accessing resources distributed across an increasingly open and variable landscape, and with the social and cognitive demands of life in a more complex, unpredictable environment, are widely believed to have been the selective forces that set the hominin lineage on its distinctive evolutionary trajectory toward upright posture, increased mobility, expanded brain capacity, and ultimately, intelligence. The gallery of Miocene megafauna extends well beyond Paraceratherium and the horse lineage, and a complete picture of the epoch requires encountering some of its more extraordinary inhabitants, animals that have no modern ecological equivalents and that illustrate the biological richness of the transitional world that the grass revolution was in the process of creating. Cenozoic, whose name means terrible beast, was a proboscidean, a member of the elephant lineage that appeared in the early Miocene and persisted until the early Pleistocene, making it one of the longest-lived genera in the elephant order. What distinguished Cenozoic from all other proboscideans, living or extinct, was the orientation of its tusks. Rather than projecting forward and upward from the upper jaw in the manner of modern elephants and most fossil proboscideans, the tusks of Cenozoic curved downward and backward from the lower jaw, creating a pair of large, hook-shaped structures that projected below and behind the chin. The functional interpretation of these unusual tusks has been debated, but the most widely accepted hypothesis suggests they were used for stripping bark from trees and pulling down branches, tools for woodland browsing rather than the digging and display functions proposed for the tusks of other proboscideans. The largest species, Cenozoic giganteum from the late Miocene of Europe, reached shoulder heights of approximately 4 meters and body masses estimated at 10 to 14 tons, making it one of the largest land animals of its time, rivaled in size only by the largest mammoths that would appear much later in the Pleistocene. Amebelodon, one of the more visually striking of the Miocene gomphotheres, had a pair of elongated, flat lower tusks that projected horizontally forward from the lower jaw like an enormous shovel, paired with shorter upper tusks. This shovel-tusker morphology is interpreted as an adaptation for feeding on aquatic vegetation and soft plants in swampy, riverine environments, the flattened lower tusks functioning as scooping tools for gathering vegetation from shallow water or muddy substrates. Amebelodon was primarily a North American genus, but related shovel-tusked proboscideans appeared independently on multiple continents. Another instance of the convergent evolution that the Miocene repeatedly produced, as similar ecological opportunities were exploited by different lineages, arriving at similar anatomical solutions. The shovel-tusker body plan represents a biological experiment that ultimately went extinct as the wet, swampy environments it was specialized for gave way to the drier, more open landscapes of the Pliocene, an ecological casualty of the same progressive aridification that was producing the grassland revolution. Teleocharis, a Miocene rhinoceros from North America, whose body proportions were strikingly different from those of any modern rhinoceros, had the low-slung, barrel-shaped body, short legs, and large head of a modern hippopotamus, rather than the high-shouldered, long-legged build of modern African or Asian rhinos. This hippo-like body plan is interpreted as evidence that Teleocharis was a semi-aquatic grazer, spending considerable time in or near water and feeding on the aquatic and semi-aquatic vegetation of river margins and lake shores, an ecological lifestyle convergent with the modern hippopotamus, despite the deep phylogenetic distance between the two groups. The discovery of mass death assemblages of Teleocharis at sites in Nebraska, where dozens of individuals of all ages died together in what appears to have been a drought-driven waterhole concentration, provides a uniquely vivid snapshot of the social behavior and ecological dependence on water of this unusual rhinoceros. Among the predators of the Miocene grassland and its margins, none captures the character of the epoch more completely than the saber-toothed felids, a group that encompasses not a single lineage but multiple convergent lineages of large cats that independently evolved the same distinctive weapon: enormously elongated upper canine teeth, sometimes extending 15 centimeters or more below the lower jaw, used for delivering killing bites to large prey. Machairodus, one of the earliest and most widespread of the true saber-toothed cats, appeared in the Middle Miocene and ranged across Eurasia, Africa, and eventually North America, reaching the size of a modern lion and preying on the large ungulates, horses, bovids, and proboscideans that were simultaneously diversifying across the expanding grassland ecosystems. The saber-tooth killing strategy is still debated among paleontologists, but the most current interpretation holds that the elongated canines were used to deliver a precise, targeted bite to the throat or lower jaw of large prey, severing major blood vessels or the trachea rather than crushing through bone. A surgical killing bite suited for large, potentially dangerous prey that needed to be dispatched quickly before it could injure the predator. Amphicyon, the bear dog, technically a member of the carnivore family. Amphicyonidae, rather than a true bear or dog, was one of the most ecologically versatile large predators of the Oligocene and Miocene, its body combining the powerful, heavy-boned construction of a bear with the longer legs and more cursorial proportions of a large dog. Amphicyon major, one of the largest species, reached body masses of approximately 100 to 200 kilograms, comparable to a modern lion, and its dental morphology, with both crushing and shearing teeth, suggests a dietary flexibility that included both large prey and significant quantities of plant material, in the manner of a modern bear. The genus is found across Eurasia and North America in Miocene deposits, making it one of the most geographically widespread large carnivores of the epoch, and its eventual extinction in the late Miocene may have been related to competitive exclusion by the increasingly diverse felid and canid predator guilds that were diversifying alongside the expanding grassland prey base. The evolution of the horse through the Miocene deserves its own detailed examination, because it is the most completely documented major evolutionary transformation in the mammalian fossil record, and because it illustrates with unusual clarity the specific biological pressures that the grass revolution applied to the animals that attempted to exploit it. The story begins not with the Miocene, but with the Eocene, where the earliest known horse relative, Eohippus, also known as Paraceratherium, was a small, dog-sized forest browser with 4 functional toes on the front foot, 3 on the rear, low-crowned teeth suitable for soft woodland vegetation, and a body plan suited for moving through dense forest understory. This animal, though recognizable as an early member of the horse lineage from its skeletal proportions and dental morphology, would have been unrecognizable as a horse to any modern observer. It was roughly the size of a fox terrier, had eyes positioned more to the side of the skull than the front-facing position of modern horses, and lacked entirely the elongated face, high-crowned teeth, and single-toed feet that define the modern horse's body plan. The progressive evolution from Eohippus to Equus, across approximately 50 million years of fossil record, is one of the most extensively studied evolutionary sequences in all of paleontology, precisely because the North American fossil record of horses is extraordinarily complete. The combination of the enormous geographic extent of the North American continent, the abundance of sedimentary basins with continuous stratigraphic records, and the relatively dry climate that favors fossil preservation has produced a horse fossil record of unparalleled completeness that documents the gradual transformation of body size, tooth crown height, and foot structure across a sequence of genera that represents one of the most compelling demonstrations of evolutionary change in deep time. The critical Miocene transition was the shift from Merychippus, a middle Miocene horse that appeared approximately 15 million years ago and that retained 3 toes but had developed dramatically higher crowned teeth than any previous horse ancestor, to the late Miocene horses of the genera Pliohippus and its relatives, which had reduced their lateral toes to small splints and developed teeth of even greater crown height. This transition coincides precisely in the North American fossil record with the major expansion of C4 grasslands. Grasslands dominated by plants that use a different photosynthetic pathway from the C3 plants that dominate forests and cooler grasslands, a pathway that is particularly efficient in warm, high-light, seasonally dry environments. The expansion of C4 grasslands in North America, documented by changes in the carbon isotope ratios of fossil tooth enamel from grazing animals, occurs approximately 7 to 5 million years ago and represents the final stage of the grassland revolution on that continent, the completion of the biological transformation that the Miocene had been building toward for the preceding 15 million years. The modern horse, Equus, which appeared approximately 3.5 million years ago, is in this sense the biological product of the grass revolution, as completely as the domestic wheat variety growing in a modern field is the product of human selection. Every feature of its anatomy that makes it recognizable as a horse, the single hoof, the long limbs, the deep jaw with its high-crowned grinding teeth, the long face that accommodates an enormous dental battery, the binocular forward-facing visual field that helps it judge distances when fleeing across open country, is an evolutionary solution to a problem that the expanding Miocene grassland created. The horse is, in the most literal biological sense, a grass-made animal. The Messinian Salinity crisis, one of the most extraordinary geological events of the Cenozoic, occupied the final stages of the Miocene from approximately 5.9 to 5.3 million years ago, and it serves as a dramatic illustration of the catastrophic consequences that tectonic processes can produce when they interrupt oceanic circulation. The Mediterranean Sea, throughout most of its history, has been connected to the Atlantic Ocean through what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, allowing the continuous exchange of Atlantic water that maintains the Mediterranean's salinity and water level. The collision of the African and European plates during the Miocene progressively restricted this connection until approximately 5.9 million years ago. The seaway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean was finally closed, cutting off the Atlantic inflow that had been compensating for the net evaporation of water from the enclosed Mediterranean basin. The Mediterranean Sea evaporates more water than it receives from rivers and rainfall combined, a net deficit that under normal conditions is compensated by the inflow of Atlantic water through the Strait of Gibraltar. Remove that inflow and the net evaporation is no longer compensated. The Mediterranean begins to shrink. Over the approximately 600,000 years of the Messinian salinity crisis, this is precisely what happened. The Mediterranean, cut off from the Atlantic, evaporated down to a fraction of its former volume, leaving behind vast salt flats and evaporite deposits, layers of halite, gypsum, and other evaporitic minerals on what had been the seafloor. At the deepest point of the crisis, the Mediterranean may have been reduced to a series of hypersaline lakes, or even, in some basins, to dry salt flats lying kilometers below sea level. The rivers draining into the Mediterranean, the Nile, the Rhone, the Ebro, found their base levels suddenly and catastrophically lowered, and they cut enormous canyons through the rock of their lower courses in response. The buried canyon of the Nile, a gorge estimated to have been deeper than the modern Grand Canyon, extending from the Mediterranean coast southward into what is now Egypt, was revealed by seismic surveys conducted during the drilling of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century. A geological legacy of the Messinian salinity crisis, hidden beneath thousands of meters of sediment deposited over the subsequent 5 million years. The restoration of the Atlantic-Mediterranean connection, the Zanclean flood, occurring approximately 5.3 million years ago at the very end of the Miocene, was, by available geological evidence, one of the most spectacular hydrological events in the history of the Cenozoic. The progressive erosion of the barrier separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean eventually allowed Atlantic water to begin flowing through the narrowing sill, and the resulting flow, channeling ever-increasing volumes of water through an initially small breach, rapidly enlarged that breach through erosional processes that fed back on themselves. The more water flowing through, the more erosion. The more erosion, the larger the channel. The larger the channel, the more water flowing through. The resulting cascade, which modeling studies suggest may have refilled the Mediterranean in as little as several thousand to tens of thousands of years, constitutes a waterfall of dimensions without any modern parallel. An estimated vertical drop of more than 3 kilometers, flowing at rates estimated at orders of magnitude larger than the modern Amazon, transporting enough water to raise global sea levels measurably as the formerly evaporated and precipitated water was returned to the world ocean. The Zanclean flood was, by any measure, the most extraordinary waterfall in the history of the planet. The June 3, 2026 study in PLOS-1. The research on Parabos tigneresi from Camp dels Ninots in northeastern Iberia represents the most recent addition to the scientific understanding of the Miocene-Pliocene transition fauna of Europe, and it captures in a single fossil site the biological moment when the Miocene's great grassland revolution was reaching its culmination in the emergence of the large bovid fauna that would eventually characterize the Pleistocene Old World. The site of Camp dels Ninots, a lake deposit in the Girona region of Catalonia, is dated to approximately 4.4 million years ago, the early Pliocene, just after the Miocene ended, and its exceptional preservation has yielded the remains of at least 14 individual Parabos tigneresi, including near-complete skulls, teeth, and postcranial skeletal elements that allow an unusually comprehensive reconstruction of both the anatomy and the ecology of this animal. Parabos tigneresi, as the study by Sorbelli, Bibi, Madurell Malapera, and colleagues establishes, was the largest bovid yet known from Europe at this time, estimated at approximately 500 kilograms, roughly the size of a large bongo or a small African buffalo. Its horns, preserved in multiple individuals including both sexes, showed a relatively modest sexual dimorphism. Both males and females carried substantial horns, a pattern more similar to the living bongo, a large forest antelope in which females as well as males are horned, than to the highly sexually dimorphic bovids of open grassland environments, where males typically carry dramatically larger horns than females. The postcranial skeleton, the limb bones, vertebrae and foot bones indicates an animal that was not primarily built for high-speed running across open plains. Its legs were not the elongated, gracile limbs of a swift grassland specialist. Instead, the proportions suggest an animal adapted for moving through complex terrain, forests, wooded areas, damp ground. The anatomical evidence and the paleo-environmental reconstruction of the Camp dels Ninots site both point to the same conclusion. Parabos tigneresi was a large bovid that lived not on the open steppe, but in the humid, vegetation-dense forest margins of the early Pliocene Iberian Peninsula. This ecological reconstruction has significant implications for understanding the trajectory of bovine evolution. The familiar large bovids of the Pleistocene and the modern world, the African buffalo, the bison of the North American plains and the European forests, the domestic cattle and their wild progenitor, the aurochs, are predominantly open country or forest edge animals, with body plans and behavioral ecologies adapted to life in environments ranging from grassland savanna to temperate woodland. The discovery that Parabos tigneresi, one of the earliest large bovids in Europe, was a humid forest dweller rather than an open country grazer, suggests that large body size in the bovine lineage evolved before the transition to fully open country grassland ecology. That the first stage of bovine body size increase was driven by factors other than the adaptations to grassland running and long-distance migration that characterize the most familiar large bovids of the Pleistocene. The precise phylogenetic position of Parabos tigneresi within the bovine evolutionary tree remains a matter of ongoing investigation. The study's authors identify two possible interpretations. Parabos may represent the earliest members of the tribe Bovini, the group that includes bison, buffalo, and cattle, or it may represent the latest members of the related Tragoportacini lineage, which was eventually displaced by the true Bovini. In either case, the animal documents an early stage in the size increase trajectory that would eventually produce the enormous aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, which reached shoulder heights of nearly 2 meters and body masses of nearly a ton, and the American bison, which at its Pleistocene maximum occurred in herds of tens of millions across the grasslands of North America, constituting perhaps the largest terrestrial animal biomass accumulation in the history of the Cenozoic. The connection between the Miocene grass revolution and the emergence of complex human civilization runs through exactly this chain of biological consequence. The domestication of cattle, sheep, goats, and horses, the foundational event of the Neolithic agricultural revolution that began approximately 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and transformed small bands of hunter-gatherers into the settled, food-producing societies from which all subsequent human civilization derives, was possible only because those animals existed, and those animals existed only because the Miocene grassland revolution had created the ecological conditions and evolutionary pressures that produced them. Without the Miocene expansion of grasslands driving the evolution of hypsodonty, ruminant digestive systems, and the social gregariousness of herd-forming ungulates, there would have been no cattle, no sheep, no horses to domesticate. Without the hominin evolutionary trajectory driven by the fragmentation of East African forest in the late Miocene, there would have been no hominids with the cognitive capacity to domesticate them. The Neolithic revolution, which made civilization possible, was built on biological raw materials that the Miocene had spent 18 million years creating. Stand in a modern temperate grassland, the prairie of North America, the steppe of Eurasia, the pampas of Argentina, and what you are standing in is one of the most recently evolved major biomes on Earth, a biological community that did not exist in its modern form 15 million years ago, and that has been expanding and transforming itself ever since. The grass beneath your feet is the product of millions of years of co-evolution with the herbivores that graze it, grass that regrows from its base rather than its tip, so that grazing stimulates rather than destroys it. Grass that produces underground rhizomes that can survive fire and drought. Grass that accumulates silica in its leaves precisely as a deterrent to the herbivores whose grazing it simultaneously tolerates and exploits. The cattle in the field beside the grassland are the end product of the bovine body size trajectory that Parabos tigneresi represents in its early stages. Animals whose teeth, digestive systems, and social behavior are all solutions to problems posed by the Miocene grassland. The horses, if there are horses, are the descendants of the North American equid radiation that the Miocene grassland drove from four-toed forest browsers to single-hoofed, high-crowned, high-speed grazers. Everything in the agricultural landscape, the crops, the livestock, the grassland itself, is, in a deep sense, a product of the Miocene. What the Parabos tigneresi study contributes to this picture is a specific, precisely dated, exceptionally well-preserved snapshot of the biological moment at which the large bovid fauna of the Old World was being assembled, the early Pliocene, just after the Miocene had ended, when the animals that would eventually be domesticated were in the early stages of the body size and ecological trajectory that would bring them to the attention of Neolithic farmers 5 million years later. The researchers who extracted the 14 individuals of Parabos tigneresi from the lake sediments of Camp dels Ninots in the Girona region, and the team at the Leibniz Institute for Evolution and Biodiversity Science in Berlin who analyzed them, have given us a window into this moment, a snapshot of a transitional animal in a transitional landscape, at the hinge between the world the Miocene made and the world we live in. The African dimension of the Miocene story is inseparable from its ultimate significance, because it is in Africa, specifically in the East African context shaped by the rift system's development and the progressive opening of the landscape that the general Miocene aridification was driving, that the evolutionary consequences of the epoch reached their most consequential expression for any observer in the present day. Africa in the early Miocene was a continent whose connection to Eurasia was still intermittent. The collision of the African and Arabian plates with Eurasia was underway, but had not yet fully established the continuous land connection through the region of modern Israel and Jordan that would eventually allow the great faunal interchanges of the later Miocene and Pliocene. The isolation of Africa during the early part of the epoch had allowed African mammals to evolve along their own trajectory, producing lineages that were sometimes dramatically different from their Eurasian counterparts. When the connection was established approximately 17 to 18 million years ago, the resulting faunal exchange in both directions, African proboscideans, bovids, and primates moving into Eurasia while Eurasian carnivores, horses, and other ungulates moved into Africa, was one of the most significant biogeographic events of the Cenozoic, transforming the fauna of both continents simultaneously. The East African rift's role in fragmenting the forest landscape has already been established. What it produced, in the increasingly mosaic environment of the late Miocene, was the evolutionary context for the earliest hominins. It was precisely in this transitional mosaic environment that the hominin lineage began its evolutionary divergence. The fossil record of the latest Miocene hominids is fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but several discoveries of the past 2 decades have provided tantalizing glimpses of the organisms living in East and Central Africa at the moment, when the human and chimpanzee lineages were separating. Sahelanthropus chadensis, discovered in Chad in 2001 by Michel Brunet and colleagues, dated to approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, is the oldest known potential hominin, a creature whose skull combines an ape-sized brain case with a surprisingly flat face and a foramen magnum positioned further forward than in chimpanzees, suggesting a more upright posture. The foramen magnum position is significant because it is the point through which the spinal cord enters the skull, and in animals that habitually walk on all fours, it is positioned toward the back of the skull, while in upright bipeds, it is positioned more centrally beneath the skull, meaning that the relatively forward position in Sahelanthropus may indicate early adaptation toward upright posture, though this interpretation remains contested. Ororin tuganensis, discovered in the Tugan Hills of Kenya in 2001, dated to approximately 6 million years ago, provides more directly skeletal evidence bearing on the question of early hominin locomotion. The femur of Ororin, while incomplete, shows features of the femoral neck and head that resemble those of later bipedal hominins more closely than those of knuckle-walking apes, suggesting that habitual bipedal locomotion had appeared in the human lineage at least 6 million years ago. In the latest Miocene, while the grassland revolution was still unfolding across the African landscape, the evolution of bipedal walking, which freed the hands from locomotory use and ultimately enabled the tool manufacture and carrying behaviors that would characterize later hominins, was in this reading a Miocene adaptation to the changing African landscape, a locomotory solution to the problem of moving efficiently across increasingly open country between the forest patches that were the primary food resources of these early hominids. The genus Ardipithecus, known from Ethiopia and dated to approximately 4.4 to 5.8 million years ago, The latest Miocene and earliest Pliocene provides the most complete anatomical picture of the earliest well-documented hominins. The discovery of a partial skeleton of Ardipithecus ramidus in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia, published in Science in 2009, after 15 years of preparation and analysis, revealed an animal that was neither a knuckle walker like modern chimpanzees, nor a fully upright biped like modern humans, but rather something genuinely intermediate, capable of walking upright on the ground while also retaining a grasping big toe that allowed arboreal climbing. The habitat reconstruction from the Middle Awash site suggests a mosaic woodland environment, not open grassland, not closed forest, but the transitional, variable landscape that the Miocene's progressive opening of the East African environment had been creating. Ardipithecus was not a creature of the open savanna, as earlier models of human origins had sometimes proposed, but a creature of the woodland grassland mosaic, an animal exploiting the boundary between two worlds, the forest world that the Miocene was closing and the grassland world that the Miocene was opening. This contextual understanding of early hominin evolution within the broader Miocene story transforms the question of human origins from a narrowly biological problem. What evolutionary pressures produced bipedalism and expanded brains into a geological and ecological one? The hominins did not evolve in a biological vacuum. They evolved in a specific landscape, at a specific moment in the history of that landscape, shaped by the same tectonic and climatic forces that were simultaneously producing the grassland revolution across Eurasia, and the diversification of the bovid fauna, whose early European representatives are documented by the Parabos tigneresi study. The uplift of the East African Rift highlands, the aridification of the continental interior, the fragmentation of forest into woodland mosaic. These are the same processes operating in Africa that were producing the steppes of Central Asia and the prairies of North America. The hominin lineage was, in this sense, one more evolutionary response to the Miocene transformation of the Earth's vegetation. One more set of solutions to the problems posed by a world in which the forest was retreating and the open country was advancing. The Parabos tigneresi study gives this chain of consequence its earliest documented European link. An animal at the hinge between the bovine ancestral forms and the Pleistocene megafauna that Neolithic farmers would eventually domesticate. The domestic cow, the animal that today numbers approximately 1 billion individuals worldwide, that provides the milk and meat and leather on which a significant fraction of human nutrition and industry depends, is, in the deepest sense, a Miocene creation. Its ancestor Bos primigenius, the aurochs, evolved in the Miocene and Pliocene from bovid lineages whose early European history is documented by Parabos tigneresi. Its teeth and digestion are Miocene innovations, already described in full. Its social behavior, the herd dynamics that made it domesticable, is a Miocene product. Every time a modern human drinks a glass of milk, eats a piece of beef, or wears a leather shoe, they are the beneficiary of 18 million years of Miocene evolutionary engineering, carried forward in the biology of an animal that the grass revolution made. The grass revolution does not announce itself. It has no single moment of origin, no dramatic impact event, no visible signature in the night sky. It proceeded over millions of years, one root system at a time, across the drying interior of every major continent on Earth, driven by the imperceptible rise of mountains and the gradual cooling of a climate that was tending across the Cenozoic toward the ice ages that would eventually define the Pleistocene. But its consequences, the teeth, the legs, the digestive systems, the herd behavior, the running speed, the predator-prey dynamics of the open plain, rewired the biology of terrestrial life more completely than almost any other single event since the Cambrian explosion created animal body plans. And at its end, in the cooling and drying late Miocene, it set the evolutionary context for the emergence of the one lineage that would eventually be able to look back on all of it and ask how it happened.